My name's Ted Young. I work at Lightstep, but mostly I'm focused on the OpenTelemetry project. I'm one of the co-founders there, helped design and architect the thing. And I'm here today with Bryan Naegele, currently at Simplebet, who's also an observability and Erlang maestro. And so we're going to be talking about where all of these domains overlap and all of the fun stuff that happens there. Bryan, do you want to give us just a bit of your background? Like, how did you come into this space?
Yeah, so been an engineer for a fair number of years now, and I started getting more and more into a little bit of observability stuff when at my previous employer about 3 years ago. We had very limited observability, and we were trying to figure out like what we wanted to do. So sounded like an interesting problem space. So I kind of jumped into it and started learning all of the things about observability. Ended up joining, so from that became a founding member of the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation Observability Working Group, where we take care of the telemetry project, all of the beam telemetry stuff, and members of ours now work on building out OpenTelemetry.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into that. I see we've got some attendees. Just want to say hi to all of them. How this is going to work is we're going to go back and forth and have a conversation about this. And then at the end, we're going to open it up to Q&A. There is a Q&A tool. Feel free to type your question into there as you think of it, and we can go over those at the end. And also I'll unmute people at the end so that you can use your words if that's your preferred method of asking questions. But one thing I always ask of participants is I'm interested what brought people to the webinar. There is a chat window here. People wouldn't mind just saying hi and what about this webinar was interesting, and just like a one-liner of why you showed up. And I'll see if I can tilt the conversation towards those subjects if they're interesting. I see we've already got a question here from Carl. Hi, Carl. What's the difference between telemetry and OpenTelemetry? And this is actually a good kickoff question here. So we've got the OpenTelemetry project, which is this cross-language standardization effort around telemetry with a focus on distributed tracing and then using distributed tracing to provide correlation and indices for metrics and logs and the other forms of observability that we like to use to kind of enrich them. But Erlang has its own telemetry project. So Bryan, could you describe like maybe the Erlang telemetry project and why OpenTelemetry might still be useful even though there's already a project in Erlang?
Yeah, so telemetry has been around for almost 3 years now, I believe. And the purpose of telemetry was that we have a lot of competing standards and there's a lot of very specific tooling that goes involved with that. Makes it kind of hard to migrate things. And so some folks decided to started to build in some more another way for library authors essentially to expose metrics. So it wasn't originally built with tracing in mind. It was kind of a thought that went into it, but it was mostly for people to be able to access metrics in a generic standardized way for the beam. And then that would allow, it was built as a building block. So it's a very low level library and it's meant to be there to expose things so that we can build things on top of it, such as the telemetry metrics project, and then now OpenTelemetry.
Yeah. So is it literally metrics, or is it more just like an event system where you're like just producing events?
Yeah, correct. It's essentially a synchronous event hook system. So you can actually kind of abuse it for some fun stuff. So, but generally, like what we want to do, what we're trying to publish are, like start stop and exception events. And then you can have one-offs as well for your own metrics. So like if there was, say, like a cache hit or miss, and these are things that with OpenTelemetry, then we can kind of bridge those two things, and you can start using the start. What we do is the libraries I've built, they span the start and stop events, or if an exception happens, and then we use information that's in those telemetry events metadata to translate that to enriched attributes onto OpenTelemetry spans.
So how do you see, where do you see the value of OpenTelemetry? What got you interested in that project, and why are you using it at Simplebet?
Yeah, so a lot of the authors on the OpenTelemetry implementation for Erlang are a lot of the same people that were involved with OpenCensus or OpenTracing. We all see the value in having finally a one size fits all standard. I mean, the XKCD joke, I guess, of like 17th standard is the one, but we really believe in this one because it has such broad support, and by it being adopted into C and CF, it has a very good prospect for long-term success. And with Google and Microsoft and Lightstep and Honeycomb and everybody else investing into this space, it's a good bet for companies to go on. And the second part that goes into that is just the way that it's been architected, in that with the OpenTelemetry collectors and such, by adopting the standard, you really avoid the vendor lock-in, and you can avoid it to the point even where applications don't have to have specific exporters for particular products. So if you're using Lightstep, for instance, you don't have to have a Lightstep exporter. Instead, larger companies especially can swap things in and out, and also ship to multiple places. And that's something that just did not exist at all before. Like the notion that like I want to ship to Lightstep and Datadog, like that, there's no way. You'd have to implement two different libraries to your application.
Yeah, I'm personally excited to see more like bespoke tooling appear as a result of this. In the past, you had to build like the whole telemetry ecosystem if you wanted to build one analysis tool, but now you get all that data for free. And so if you just want to focus on doing something cool with it, you could kind of focus on just adding that one piece of value to the system. So I'm hoping there's going to be like a kind of a greenfield of opportunity there for people interested.
There's going to be some interesting stuff that sprouts out.
Yeah. We can maybe get into some of that interesting stuff around testing in a minute, because I know that's the thing we both geek out on. But I think first I'm interested in production issues. Like at Simplebet, you have some pretty tough problems. So I'm curious, how do you apply observability to the problems that you're facing over at Simplebet?
Yeah, so our first major problem was that we were coming to market with a consumer product, which was a new thing for us, for the company. And so it wasn't a discipline that the company really had at the time. So when I joined, we were essentially going from a very controlled number of, say, like 5 or 6 customers consuming a RabbitMQ feed to being prepared for, like very large numbers of consumers actually connecting directly to a free-to-play product. And so our traffic patterns are very spiky because they follow with, is there a game going? How many games are going? How many people are placing bets, and so on and so forth. So our traffic patterns are quite erratic. They're not nice and smooth and simple. From my e-commerce days, you could pretty much say it's 10 o'clock and there's going to be X amount of people buying X amount of product this hour. So for us, OpenTelemetry and just for anybody that's afraid of running OpenTelemetry in production, we've now been running for about 9 months now. And so it's good to go. Like even since 0.4, it's been very solid. But so our traffic patterns are very, very spiky, and we also had to be prepared to not have like bugs on day one. Like we had to minimize what we had out there. So it was very important for us to have tooling that available that when we ran stress tests and such internally, that we were able to suss out as many things as possible as early as possible.
Right. Yeah, this kind of gets into this interesting discussion of like testing and CICD and kind of move observability up the stack, because there's observing things in production and then root causing issues. And, I'm sure we could go into how you approach root causing issues, but to a certain degree, I feel like that's maybe generic information. Though if you've got some special tips there, that would be great. Actually, like let's focus on that, and then let's spend the last 10 minutes or so on CICD, because we'll geek out on that for a long time. Like when it comes to production observability, especially now that tracing and these things are available, do you have like advice for people on like one, what to do ahead of time besides testing this stuff? Like what do you want to make sure you have set up? And two, when you're root causing stuff, do you have any advice that you think is helpful?
Yeah, it's a great question. When you're getting started, like it can be overwhelming, and people can approach it, especially if they've been using something that kind of looks like an APM. In the Beam world, we don't really quite have that problem because APMs are very hard to pull off in the Beam. So rather than, what I suggest to people to do is to always just start at the very boundaries of your application. So if you're running an API or something, or a web server, or you're ingesting messaging and such, just start there. Put some stuff around there, and that's going to give you like a very early indicator of at least like narrowing. Because when we're trying to like figure out a root cause, like it's about segmenting like as you go along. Like just start pointing yourself in the right direction. And so these tools all help, but the first way to help yourself is get your boundaries as far out in the boundaries as you can, and then focus on like the really critical things like around database access or HTTP client calls. Once you get through those things, then for us, like we actually, I in particular will actually shift around where we trace within an application, because when we're introducing something new, or like we want to like focus on a certain area just to make sure, like try to narrow something down, we might like improve, like I guess add more tracing and more spans through that part of the code stack. And then once we're comfortable with it, we'll actually pull it back out, because it just becomes a little bit noisy. Like we don't need to trace around every call this particular thing. We just wanted to see like which of these 4 function heads were getting called. And so you can just kind of shift things around. It can be a fluid thing. It doesn't have to be static, like go trace all your functions. Probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Because you're going to generate a lot of spans. So try to give yourself the best signal to noise.
Yeah. You have an advice when you're going to root cause, you kind of have your dashboard of metrics, like your aggregates, and then you have your traces and your tracing data. Do you have a way that you go about using those tools together?
Yeah. So our metrics, since OTel still isn't quite there yet on the metric side, we continue to use Prometheus in that regard. And so we really kind of use that at this point more for kind of business analysis and general health. So looking at things like, what is the distribution of WebSocket connections currently across our nodes? Just to see, this is kind of stuff like that. But when there's an issue that happens, or something's kind of going wrong, hopefully we have a stream set up in Lightstep, and we might have an alert on that. If we don't, people usually kind of find stuff, because we do try to practice. We're trying to get better at it every day on continuous deployment and delivery. So we ship very small whenever possible, so we can catch those things earlier. So if we see an issue, one of the things I'll do personally is I'll go into the Explorer or into the second tab. I'm gonna forget it right now. But it's a list of all of your operations that are going on, and I'll just go and like sort by error percentage or by P95 or something, and just make sure everything just kind of looks good. If I do see something, then I'll click into there and I'll use some of the causal analysis tools to try and narrow down within that particular thing what's going on and where it's at.
Yeah. So you really focus on the tracing tools when it comes to root causing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about, it's about the mean time to resolution. So like when we have these excellent tools, like these tracing tools, then, like it allows us to very quickly figure out whether or not something is widespread, for instance. Just last week, I started getting alerts that bet placement was failing at almost 100%. And I went in and was very quickly able to see it was all coming from a single IP. And so it was actually just one person that was having problems. It wasn't a widespread issue. And so it's something that we can kind of ignore. We can go investigate it later, but it's not like an emergency.
Right. Is there a particular, so, in Lightstep, there's like your kind of general purpose tracing tools, looking at the tracing data, getting aggregates of latency and error percentage. But then there's also these analysis tools like correlations and things like that. Is there, on the analysis tool front, I'm curious, is there anything there that you're like, wow, that's like a useful tool? I'm glad I have that particular thing in my tool belt.
Yeah, the correlations are huge. And once you click into so being able to group by error, so you can very quickly like get down to only looking at errors, or sorting by latency, and then being able to go into there. And as you find spans and you click on them and say like, oh, this particular operation, it might be upstream or downstream from there. The fact that it's all in one place is very helpful. And so I'm able to go into a particular span and actually also then just switch how I'm viewing everything and click on just that particular operation. And now I'm looking at everything within that operation, and I can see like maybe it's not something that was just coming in this particular API call. Maybe it's affecting across all of them. So that's, for me, that's very helpful as well.
I think I need to do a video on this at some point, because there's this pattern you get into, I think, at Lightstep, and probably any tool that gives you the data this quickly, where you're kind of pivoting, right? You're doing these pivots where you're looking at one thing and that gives you some information. You're quickly pivoting to another view of that information. And it's this kind of cycle you get into that's, in the past, I found it hard to do with things like logging. Or basically doing the same pattern, but the amount of effort you have to do to get the data would kind of like slow me down to the point that,
yeah, precisely. Because
yeah.
you have to like go, like I find some tag, for instance, and then like, this isn't to knock, like let's say like Datadog, for instance, but like if I want to then search only on this particular attribute that's within a particular piece of information, I have to go create like another like predefined filter thing that then lets me like search through it. So it's about speeding up all these things, and that's where you can start feeling really confident about shipping a lot more often to production, because if something does go wrong, your code that you're shipping is hopefully very small and you can just turn things on and off. But then also you can find the issue much more quickly.
Yeah. Well, speaking of shipping things to production, let's switch to that part. So I think you and I are both fans about taking these runtime observability tools and trying to move them up the release pipeline as far as they can go and catch things before they get into production. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts? I know you're in the process of trying to apply these things, but where do you see the most value there right now?
Yeah, my dream goal here is to be able to get our CI pipelines and to a point where it's only doing the amount of CI that is necessary for what you're changing. So if I change a markdown file, I probably don't need to run the whole test suite and build a Docker image and everything else. and even so, then even getting to the point where you're even getting nuance within what parts of the code base have been touched, as to determine whether or not to run certain things. So we've got the basics right now, where like, like if we don't touch a JavaScript file, like we don't have to build all those Docker layers. We just skip all that kind of stuff. But the next step for me is like, did code change within a critical path? And if so, go ahead and spin up some games with the current release that's running on staging. Take Lightstep has some GitHub Actions out there. Be able to take a snapshot of what's going on then, and then push the new release and let it run for a little bit under load and see, like did latencies drastically change or something. And there's a lot of companies that have been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, but it's typically like a nightly job that they run, or every night they'll run a performance test, like just as clockwork. But that can get very expensive, obviously. So
Right.
even then, you still want the tooling. Like I know at Riot Games they would do that, and then post every result every night would get posted to Confluent, for instance. And in this case, like it's a dream thing to just be able to get it down to a PR even before you merge it up.
Yeah, I really liked that idea you had around someone makes a PR, you can automatically detect that this PR touches a hot critical code path. So you spin up some performance analysis there, take a snapshot to identify any changes even before the PR gets merged.
Or even with property testing, right? So like normally, like our property tests run a very low set on a normal PR, and then we have a larger run that runs every day. But if you're touching that critical code path, you're like in our betting, for instance, yeah, why not spend the extra like couple of minutes running a much larger property test and just make sure everything's working correctly.
And that avoids like this tension that I've certainly felt on the engineering floor, where it's like you want to do all this rigorous testing, but that all costs time and money, and then that slows down all of the changes. And then you don't like that slowness, you want speed, but then if you pull out all of that time consuming testing, then you might miss something. And so by just selectively applying it and kind of having more of a gradient from critical to not critical, you kind of get the best of both worlds there.
Yeah, and for me, it's interesting because in like personally, like my end objective, obviously we want things to run well, and we want things to be tested well and everything else. The shipping for the sake of shipping quickly is, in and of itself is, sure, it's interesting or whatever, but the benefit for me is being able to then keep your team sizes smaller, and it prevents this like growth problem where you're having to continually add people because it takes so long to like deploy stuff or to test it. And so at the end, it's about being able to deliver more value more quickly with a smaller team that, and that's, I love that. I like working in small organizations. So like, I don't want to grow to 50 engineers because we have to.
Yeah. There's also this granularity of change aspect that I find, especially around performance bugs. I mean, like any kind of bug, but I find performance bugs tend to be the strange ones. Like sometimes it's very obvious, but it's often odd what particular change caused that. And so it's sort of like the fewer changes, the more frequently you can make those kinds of tests, you're also testing a smaller subset of changes, which means it's a lot easier to identify which particular change the problem popped up in.
Yeah, like if you have something that's calling like a database, for instance, and you were infrequently doing that, and you're not calling that code directly. Let's say you start calling from a high frequency operation that then happens to touch that one. Then all of a sudden it went up 20x, and so you're like, oh, I need caching now. I need to do something there. But yeah, for me, like it's like tracking down performance and improving performance is like, it's like a drug hit for me. It's my absolute favorite thing to do is performance tuning.
That stuff is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I've definitely been in cases where it's like, you do have your big smoke test before going to production, and then it does identify there's a performance problem. But at that point, you've like so much code from so many different paths have merged in. And if you're gatekeeping everything at that point, then it's now like, okay, nothing can get deployed until we sort this problem out, because you've got this singular bottleneck where you're doing all of that testing.
Yeah. And so to your earlier point of like cutting that down, and the other things that I frequently see, and these are just really subtle things in people's testing strategies, is they fail to simulate real world conditions. And it can even be like, it's fine that you're running, like I can handle 25,000 users, but if it's 25,000 users that are using the same 5 jots and have the same permissions, usually once you actually put it up to like 25,000 unique users, things start falling apart really quickly. So yeah, it kind of dovetails into the, like how do you simulate, like how do you bring production to testing? And then, like there's then that next step, which is a little bit more, definitely more challenging, a little bit more subtle, of like actually getting canary. And for a lot of organizations, like getting to that point is, even for me, is like a very long stretch goal to get to. Step one is just being able to say things like, like when I run a test, like I feel confident because it actually does look like real world traffic.
And so you're a big fan of property testing and some of these lesser known tools that are more like formal proofing and things like that. Do you feel like those kind of fit into this real world scenario aspect that you're talking about?
Those can, I mean, like those get into like finding the situations that you didn't think of. When we think of unit testing, most of the time when people are unit testing, it's an example based test. And so it's not so much like generating random traffic. There are tools that people use like Faker and whatnot that, do a little bit of that, but they don't really go to the extent. So for myself, like we have a particular set of operations, which is a user places a bet or attempts to place a bet, and then something happens in the game, and let's say it gets resulted, and then but the thing was wrong, so we have to like undo that result and then void it or re-result it to something else. And to have confidence to say that like I can chain a sequence of like 50 different operations at completely random things, and at the end of the day the wallet balance is what is supposed to be, like for me, like that's really critical, because that's a very subtle bug, and we've had some very subtle bugs that happen there. That only come out in that kind of test, but they're set at, they work well for certain aspects. So there's no one size fits all for everything. There are places for unit tests and example based tests, because like even on a property test, like there are specific examples that you might find that the property test like may not generate. And so once you do find it, having that in there as a check is, like helpful.
Yeah. My own personal hobby horse, once OpenTelemetry is fully stable on all the basics, is this idea of being able to take that trace data and lifting all different kinds of testing you're doing up to being testing on top of the data, so that you can establish those invariants using whatever kind of testing tool you want. When X is true, I expect Y to be false. And then being able to check those invariants along the way. So you're checking it at the unit test level, you're checking it at the kind of integration test level. But then when you get into production, you hit this new level of scale where invariants can cease to hold true, just because now your message queue is just operating at a scale and it's more distributed than it was in any kind of canary that you ran. And So
Yeah.
there's always this like last gap where something about the production environment is different enough from your testing environment, and how do you make sure invariants hold across that gap?
Yeah, and it can get very expensive very quickly if you're trying to replicate 100% what your production traffic is. And I've seen people do some interesting things, but they do it like on a rarity. Like if they want to simulate like a game day or something, they will actually, like kind of ghost duplicate their live traffic, but then multiply it. But even then, like you're multiplying the same traffic. So there are these things that come out that like you're not expecting to find. And so having the tooling in place to be able to find it is as quickly as possible is the best tool that you can have in your tool belt.
Awesome. Okay, so we're kind of at time. This has been a lot of fun. I do want to switch over to Q&A can you hang out for like 7 minutes, Bryan? Does that work? If we go till great.
Sure.
So what I'm gonna do, people, please feel free to use that Q&A tool. That's an option down at your Zoom bar at the bottom to type questions in. I'm also going, if you want to raise your hand, I can turn your mic on. So those are your two options for asking questions at this time, if you got any. And that raise hand tool is sitting right next to that Q&A tool down at the bottom. Cool. Hi, David Lucia. You got a question. Are there features of Elixir and Erlang that uniquely position it in terms of observability?
Yes, but unfortunately not in a good way. So the benefits of the actor pattern and messaging and everything else are fantastic for running production systems. But unfortunately, the idea of being able to trace the context of what's going on with those things across boundaries then becomes extremely complicated, because there is no, like single global process. We're not in a single thread necessarily. We don't know, there's no way to kind of like, say that's the place to go look at for this thing. So having to attach context is something that we're all, like in observability and tracing used to when it comes to adding these, like propagating context onto HTTP calls, for instance. But that can get very heavy as well. So first step for us is, like eventually at some point we're going to try to get into OTP, some kind of context passing capabilities when it comes to the messages. But right now that's a lacking thing. So it's very much a hand rolled, you have to do it yourself kind of deal.
Yep. Yeah, and that kind of goes for any kind of event-driven system. I feel like you've got this loose coupling, which is nice, but that also means the actual execution graph is a little hard to get your hands on, and often can turn out to be something you didn't expect necessarily. So being able to recreate that execution graph becomes a lot more important in those event-driven systems.
Yeah.
Cool beans. Do we have any more questions? And again, if you want to just use your mic and ask questions instead of typing, just raise your hand. Well,
all right.
Like not a heck of a lot. That's okay. I hope you all enjoyed. Here we go. Typing these questions takes a little bit of time. I think that's part of the problem. Radu, nice to meet you. They ask, are there any APIs available in Lightstep that you're leveraging for bespoke tools? Yeah, making use of the APIs at all?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We are currently kind of architecting our first thing that will leverage the APIs. We have a project coming up to introduce very comprehensive health checks of and being able to roll those up to expose them to our team or to customers. And so we need to roll up essentially what's going on across the entire system at a granular level that's probably more granular than things are used to, and roll that all up and expose it. So like basically from the very second that we get a message coming in on the wire that something happened in a game all the way to the end, that touches a lot of different services, and each game can have certain things going on with it. So one of our goals, right, one of the things we're going to be building out soon is exactly that. And so part of that is rather than generating through Prometheus or something which is not very granular, our like p-values, for instance, we will then use we're going to leverage the Lightstep APIs and say like, hey, for this service and this operation and everything else, like give us these precise things, and we'll roll those up to a unified dashboard that's for, like other people's consumption.
Nice. And a follow-up question, which I think is also a good one. Are there use cases you're thinking of that are not yet supported by the existing APIs? What APIs do you wish Lightstep had that we don't have yet?
Well, I don't know. We'll have to get more into it, but I have heard some interesting ones of being able to search through and pull specific spans, or to trace or to generate a latency between two span types within an operation. So let's say you have an overall trace going and you're through these three spans and it's in different services, and then you get an event that's happening in this particular service, and you're wanting to measure two spans that are nested down. What is that latency between start and stop there? And so you have to essentially create an ephemeral new parent for those two IDs to correlate them. That I have heard that one, and it's interesting. Like it could be useful, but the whole thing with tracing is like everything's a parent and child. So what happens when you want to measure two children against each other?
And I would say, in general, there's always room for improving querying around things that are a little more disparate and being able to compare them. There's always going to be room for improving that. We got Carl here. Are there any specific business metrics that you want to be able to track alongside your traces? So I think Carl's maybe asking about correlating business metrics with traces.
That is something I currently do. And I mean, like we do use a roll up, or I do, of within Lightstep. I've done this for a long time within Prometheus, which is to actually like your number one indicator of health is if we go back out to the boundaries, if the specific actions that end users are taking, those can actually tell you early on whether or not something's wrong. So synthetic monitoring and stuff is one of those tools that allows you to automate that. But even if it doesn't catch something, like in an e-commerce situation or in a betting situation, like we have, like low volumes of people being able to check out or something, or getting to that end goal, like that can be a very quick indicator of like something is wrong, and like no alarms are going off. Because the hard part about observability is like you don't always have an alarm set on stuff, and things just slip by. So that's where things get really interesting to me, is as you can push things out to synthetic users and such, and just monitoring those. It would be the best starting point for me personally.
Yeah, this is also a place where having access to an expanded window of live information, we're aiming for like an hour of recall of like 100% of data, and being able to retroactively generate graphs and do queries across that hour. I mean, days and weeks or even better. But I
And
know
going
that,
back to like what you were talking about before about the, like generating test data and whatever else, even in synthetic monitoring, like you're generating scripts ahead of time. So if you could take trace data of what real users are doing and generating random scripts from that for your synthetic users to then perform going forward, then I mean, that makes your life a lot easier.
yeah. Somewhat on a related note of combining metrics and tracing, when OpenTelemetry metrics is finished, one of the advantages there will be the addition of trace exemplars onto metrics. So the same way in your latency and error graphs right now, you get exemplars of like what those aggregates are being generated by. Just having that ability on like any metric that you're looking at, being able to just quickly pop into example traces of things that generated that metric. I'm hoping that'll also be like one more tool in this tool belt of helping you move quick.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, we got one more question, and then I think we'll probably have to cut it off so I can let you go, Bryan. But Radu asks, what advantages do you see in using Prometheus alongside with Lightstep? Are there any impediments in using metrics and traces in Lightstep only?
For us, it's a matter of practicality because we do still need metrics at some level, and it's just not available yet in OpenTelemetry. I do expect fully to move 100% off of Prometheus, and this, we can make that decision because we use Lightstep.
Yeah.
If we were having to ship 100% of our data, like 100% of the time, and you get into these things where the business model is like the storage cost and whatnot, and people aren't able to generate those kind of rolled up derived metric buckets and whatever, then it would be a different consideration.
Yeah, Lightstep recently released some metrics tooling that are straight metrics, and we're investing heavily in that in the future. Are you sending any of your Prometheus data to those tools and dashboards yet, or are you just using the Prometheus dashboards kind of separately?
Yeah, we're not just yet. I know that it has definitely been on our list of things to do, and so I think that we're pretty close. I believe that we have possibly been given a Helm chart that will now make it easy, and it's more of a complication of us being on Rancher, I believe. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, we do use Grafana. The thing that I'm really excited about, hopefully that continues to improve over time at Lightstep, is really building out that querying ability and the alerting that you can get out of that. That's where like a tool like Grafana is incredibly powerful, and being able to drill down to exactly the things that you want to show in rolled up ways, and then being able to generate kind of complex queries as to like when alerts should happen. This is particularly true for us because we go from zero volume to very high volume, and so when you're at zero volume and there's 3 calls that make an error on the one thing, then yeah, you're above 50% error rate now. So just being able to do things like that to kind of smooth things out is going to be a bonus for us.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I think a lot of fun stuff like that is coming to Lightstep.
Yep.
Hopefully in this coming year. And I think we're at time at this point. So I want to thank you, Bryan, for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks.